The 1950s were dangerous, not just because of the racing, not just because of the speed, but because cars were evolving faster than the world could control them. Imagine the scene: far worse roads, narrow tires, brakes that were still extremely limited. And yet, some European manufacturers decided to create machines capable of exceeding 155, even 185 miles per hour. Lightweight cars. Brutal. Often with virtually no assistance for the driver. Just engine, speed, and courage. And that's exactly what makes these cars so special. So in this video, you're going to discover the fastest European cars of the 1950s. And when you see what they were already capable of more than half a century ago, you'll understand why some of these cars were genuinely terrifying. 1958 Ferrari 250 GT Tour de France. This car was not created for cruising. It was created to dominate roads, and that completely changes its personality, because the 250 GT Tour de France occupies a very particular place within Ferrari history. It's not a pure competition machine like some of the brand's more extreme models, but it's also far from being a conventional Grand Tourer. It sits exactly in the middle, and that's where it becomes dangerous. Imagine the context. Late 1950s, long-distance races crossing cities, mountains, and open roads. Events where top speed alone wasn't enough. The car had to survive. It had to remain fast for hours, and Ferrari understood perfectly how to achieve that. The result was this: a long, low, elegant coupe, but with constant visual tension. The lines look clean, refined, but at the same time, they communicate movement even while standing still. And that's what makes it special. Because this car doesn't need to look aggressive, its stance already says everything. Under the hood, the 3-liter V12 produced around 260 to 280 horsepower, a brutal figure for the late 1950s, especially in a relatively lightweight car, and that allowed it to exceed 155 miles per hour. Yes, more than 155 miles per hour in 1958. And that's where you begin to understand why these cars were so serious. There's a key detail. The Tour de France name wasn't marketing. It came directly from Ferrari's dominance in the famous Tour de France automobile race. And that gave the car an almost intimidating reputation. Because it wasn't just fast, it won. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Ferrari 250 GT Tour de France can easily exceed $5 million, with exceptional examples reaching far higher figures. It's not Ferrari's most extreme car. It's not the rarest, but probably it's one of the best representations of the perfect combination between elegance and brutal speed. 1956 Maserati 450S. This car doesn't look dangerous. It looks completely out of control. And honestly, it was. Because the Maserati 450S represents one of the most extreme moments of the entire decade. A period where manufacturers were still discovering just how far they could push power, and Maserati decided to go too far. Imagine the context: mid-1950s, Ferrari dominating, Mercedes pushing boundaries, Jaguar growing stronger in racing, and Maserati responded with this: a monster, a car built almost entirely around a gigantic engine. The proportions already make it obvious that something here is not normal. The massive hood, the aggressive stance, the sensation that the entire car is struggling to contain what's underneath. And that's not exaggeration. Under the hood, the 4.5-liter V8 produced around 400 horsepower. 400 horsepower in 1956, a ridiculous number even decades later. And that transformed the 450S into a brutally fast machine, capable of exceeding 185 miles per hour depending on configuration. But here's the most important detail. The car couldn't always control all that power, and that gave it a very specific reputation: fast, but wild. Because driving something like this in the 1950s, with narrow tires, no electronic aids, and on circuits that were far more dangerous, was something completely different. There's a key fact. Only around 9 Maserati 450S cars were ever produced, and that makes it one of the rarest and most extreme racing cars of the entire era. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Maserati 450S can easily exceed $10 million at auction. 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. This car doesn't look real. It looks far too advanced to exist in the 1950s, and that's exactly what makes it so impressive. Because while many manufacturers were still trying to figure out how to build faster cars, Mercedes was already thinking several steps ahead. The 300 SLR wasn't simply powerful, it was extreme engineering. Imagine the context: Mercedes dominating motorsport, trying to build the fastest and most sophisticated car possible, and using everything they had learned in Formula One to create something completely different. And the result was this: a lightweight, aggressive, incredibly refined machine for its time, with a body designed to slice through the air in a way very few cars could back then. Everything feels advanced, everything feels engineered with precision, and that completely changes the perception of the car, because here, there's no unnecessary excess, only performance. Under the hood, the 3-liter straight 8 produced around 300 horsepower, an astonishing figure. But once again, the number doesn't tell the whole story, because this car was extremely lightweight, and that made it absurdly fast. In some configurations, it could exceed 180 miles per hour, dangerously close to 190. And we're talking about 1955. That was no longer just speed, it was insanity. There's a key detail. The 300 SLR became one of the most dominant cars of the entire decade, winning legendary races like the Mille Miglia, where Sterling Moss delivered one of the greatest performances in motorsport history. And that helped turn the car into an instant legend. When you look at its value today, it's not even easy to calculate anymore, because it practically never appears on the market. And now I want to know something. Out of the 3 cars we've seen so far, which one feels the most extreme to you? The balanced Ferrari, the completely wild Maserati, or this absurdly advanced Mercedes? Let me know in the comments. 1955, Jaguar D-Type. This car wasn't designed like the others, and you notice that immediately, because the Jaguar D-Type looks more like a fighter jet than a traditional race car. And honestly, that was part of the idea. Imagine the context. Jaguar realizing that speed no longer depended only on raw power, that aerodynamics were becoming just as important. And instead of following the traditional path, they decided to create something radically different. The result was this: an incredibly low car, visually clean, with smooth, long shapes designed to move through the air with as little resistance as possible. But there's one detail that changes everything: the famous rear fin. That vertical piece behind the driver that makes the car look like it came from another planet. It wasn't there for styling, it was there for high-speed stability. Pure engineering, turned into visual identity. And that's what makes the D-Type impossible to confuse with anything else. Under the hood, the 3.4-liter inline-6 produced around 250 to 285 horsepower, depending on the version. A strong figure. But again, the key wasn't only the power, it was efficiency, because this car was unbelievably aerodynamic for its era, and that allowed it to exceed 175 miles per hour. Something absurdly fast in the 1950s, especially at races like 24 Hours of Le Mans. There's a key fact. The D-Type completely dominated Le Mans during the second half of the decade, winning multiple times and becoming one of the most successful cars in Jaguar history. And that gave it an almost mythical reputation. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Jaguar D-Type can easily exceed $15 million at auction. It's not the most powerful, but probably it's one of the smartest, because this car understood something before many others did. To go faster, you don't always need a bigger engine. 1954 Porsche 550 Spyder. This car doesn't look terrifying until you understand what it was capable of, because the 550 Spyder completely breaks the logic of this list. While other manufacturers focused on huge engines, more displacement, more raw power, Porsche chose a different path. Make the car as light as possible, and that changed everything. Imagine the moment. The 1950s still obsessed with size and horsepower, And Porsche arrives with something tiny, incredibly low, minimalist, almost fragile looking. But don't be fooled. This car was extremely serious. The proportions are tiny. The windshield feels almost non-existent. The driver practically sits on the asphalt itself. Everything communicates one single idea: pure speed. No luxury, no comfort, no excess. And that's exactly what made it so fast. Under the hood, the small 1.5-liter flat 4 produced around 110 horsepower. Yes, only 110. But here, the number doesn't matter, because the car weighed almost nothing, and that allowed it to exceed 135 miles per hour, while also delivering a completely different level of agility compared to most cars of the era. And that's the key, because the 550 Spyder didn't try to win through brute force, it tried to win by being smarter. There's an important detail. This car quickly became a legend in motorsport, especially in technical and endurance races, where its balance and lightweight construction made an enormous difference. And that helped build Porsche's entire sporting identity. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. An original Porsche 550 Spyder can easily exceed $4 million. 1956 Maserati A6G/54. This car doesn't look like it was built for racing, but it was far faster than it appeared, because the A6G/54 represents the exact moment when Italian Grand Tourers began combining two very different worlds: absolute elegance and real performance. Imagine the context: mid-1950s. Maserati already respected in motorsport, but wanting to bring part of that experience into more refined, more exclusive, more sophisticated road cars, and the result was this: an elegant coupe, low, incredibly harmonious, with proportions that look hand-drawn. And honestly, they practically were, because many examples received bodies from different Italian coach builders: Zagato, Alemanno, Frua, and that meant almost every car had its own visual personality. And that's the most interesting detail, because the A6G/54 didn't attract attention through aggression. It attracted attention through purity, through its clean lines, its balance, that constant sense of motion, even while standing still. Under the hood, the 2.0-liter inline-six produced around 150 horsepower. It doesn't sound like an absurd number, but once again, the number alone doesn't tell the whole story, because this car was lightweight, extremely refined, and aerodynamically efficient for its era. And that allowed it to exceed 125 miles per hour, something remarkable for such an elegant GT in the 1950s. There's an important detail. Very few A6G/54s were ever built, around 60 cars in total, and that made it one of the rarest and most exclusive Maseratis of the entire decade. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Maserati A6G/54 can easily exceed $3 million depending on the body style and history. And now, I want to know something. What impresses you more about these European cars from the 1950s? The absolute brutality of cars like the Maserati 450S, or this mixture of elegance and speed found in cars like the A6G/54? Let me know in the comments. 1955, Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint Veloce. This car doesn't look fast until it starts moving, because the Giulietta Sprint Veloce proves something extremely important about European sports cars of the 1950s. You didn't need a gigantic engine to create something truly quick, and Alfa Romeo understood that perfectly. Imagine the context: Italy beginning to produce lighter, more compact, more agile sports cars, machines that didn't depend on absurd horsepower to feel exciting. And the result was this: a small coupe, elegant, incredibly balanced, with lines so clean they still look modern today. And that's part of its magic, because this car doesn't try to intimidate, it tries to flow. The body designed by Bertone has a very particular simplicity. Nothing feels unnecessary, nothing feels exaggerated, everything is perfectly proportioned, and that gives it a completely different identity within this list. Under the hood, the small 1.3-liter four-cylinder produced around 90 horsepower in Veloce specification. Yes, 90 horsepower. But once again, that doesn't explain the car, because here, the key was weight. The Giulietta was incredibly lightweight, and that allowed it to exceed 110 miles per hour, something very serious for such a compact coupe in 1955. And more importantly, the driving sensation was completely different, more precise, more alive, more connected. There's an important detail. The Veloce version was a more focused and sporting interpretation of the regular Giulietta Sprint, lighter, faster, and far more special. And that helped turn it into one of the most important Alfa Romeos of the entire decade. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Giulietta Sprint di Veloce can easily exceed $150,000 to $300,000, depending on originality and condition. 1954 Jaguar XK120. This car didn't need to prove anything because it was already a legend. And honestly, it had earned that status because the XK120 wasn't just one of the fastest European cars of the 1950s for a period of time. It was directly one of the fastest production cars in the world. And that completely changes its importance. Imagine the context. The late 1940s and early 1950s. Most cars still prioritizing comfort and practicality. And then Jaguar arrives with something completely different. Low, elegant, and absurdly fast. The design already makes it clear that this car was built around speed. The impossibly long hood, the flowing lines, the low and clean body. Everything communicates motion. Everything feels designed to cut through the air. And that's why the XK120 still looks special even today. Because it doesn't rely on exaggeration. It relies on proportion. Under the hood, the 3.4-liter inline-six produced around 160 to 220 horsepower, depending on the version. A very serious figure for the early 1950s, and enough to push the car beyond 125 miles per hour. Something completely astonishing for a road-going sports car of that era. In fact, the 120 in its name was a direct reference to the 120 miles per hour it could achieve. And at that time, that felt almost impossible. There's a key detail. The XK120 helped completely transform Jaguar's image around the world, turning the brand into a symbol of both speed and elegance at the same time. And that marked the beginning of something much bigger for the company. When you look at its value today, that reflects it too. A Jaguar XK120 can easily exceed $150,000 to $400,000, depending on the version and originality. And when you look at all of these cars together, you start to realize something very clearly. The 1950s were far more extreme than most people imagine. And now, I want to know something. Out of every car you saw in this video, which one feels the most impressive to you, the most terrifying, the most advanced, or simply the most incredible? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to discover the other side of this decade, you have to watch this video about the rarest European cars of the 1950s, because there you'll find machines that were even stranger, more exclusive, and in some cases, practically unknown. And when you compare them to the cars from this video, you'll understand just how wild the 1950s really were.